So I want to begin by paying deference to the Ojibwe and Dakota peoples, whose land is the basis for this gathering. And I appreciate my fellow panelists and participants of this conference who've encouraged us to do this again and again. You know, ultimately, a lot of the research I'll be discussing today is about what it means to be stolen people on stolen land. So I think it's an appropriate way to contextualize it. Also, I want to thank Karen Ho for the invitation, as well as Sarah Cronquist and the rest of the organizers. So what I'm going to try to do, sure. Oh, sure, yeah, feel free, feel free. No, it's okay, it's okay. What I'm going to try to do is talk about some of the research I've done in light of the broader question of reparations, and some of the other papers that have been presented as well. And I think, given what Karen was saying in the introduction about some of my interest in actuarial methods, I guess I want to say at the outset that one of the things I find most interesting about the reparations debate is, you know, while I think the emphasis on sort of holistic, reparative, restorative dimensions of reparations are very important, I think it's interesting that um, in our daily lives, we rely heavily on actuarial protocols without thinking very much of them and find them rather mundane. You know, if God forbid someone was to leave this gathering and get hit by a car, in a matter of minutes, an actuary could come up with an amount that that family will be presented with, either in the case of injury or even worse, in the case of death. And that calculation will be based on various risk factors in the person's life, family medical history, projected future wages, the circumstances of the accident, and we participate in these protocols all the time without thinking of them as particularly controversial. It seems that it's precisely when something like reparations comes up, then all of a sudden people say like, oh, but you know, slavery, its damage is priceless. How could we come up with a figure that's appropriate for that? And or people say something like, "Wow, we think about centuries and centuries of slavery and genocide, and we can't just throw money at the problem." So I think my contribution to the conversation is to say that we can throw money at the problem. In my experience, oppressed people love it when you throw money at the problem. And even if you can't solve the problem that way, it's a hell of a start, at least. So I'll say I have 3 points I want to make, I guess, about the question of reparations. One is about research methodology. One is about sort of legal subjectivity or the legal basis. And one is about like the fiscal basis for a reparations project. In terms of research methodology, so it was mentioned I've done research on slave insurance and life insurance. And in that connection, we know a lot of the historical work about insurance has typically been about thinking about slaves as cargo. There's the famous or infamous case of the Zong, 1789. The ship captain had 132 enslaved people thrown overboard because there wasn't enough water for both the enslaved people and the crew to make it to their destination, and he just wanted to recover the insurance money. So this sort of fired abolitionist sentiment and got people sort of outraged that you could just treat human life in a way that's so cavalier. But what interests me is sort of insurance and slavery as it's related to the last few decades of legalized slavery. In particular, between the period of 1808, when the slave trade to the U.S. was outlawed, and 1865, when slavery was legally abolished, what you notice when you look at slave insurance policies is that slaves who were insured typically fell in one of a few different categories. They were either usually enslaved people working in hazardous and lucrative enterprises like coal mining, railroad construction, steamboat traffic. They were usually artisans like cobblers, blacksmiths, wheelwrights. They were bureaucrats like clerks, or they were slaves with proven expertise in managing domestic affairs like cooks, butlers, barbers, drivers, maids. So what this suggests is that there's something happening in the last few decades of legalized slavery that privileges the skill set of enslaved people. And I think that's interesting, particularly when it comes to the question of reparations and the idea of slaves as property. I mean, one thing it suggests is that in the marketplace or in daily life, there was a realization that enslaved people had very important influential roles, that they had market value and skills that were marketable, that sort of defied their legal status as property. Because part of what's important about insured slaves is that they, unlike other forms of property, an insured slave could accrue value over time, more and more value actually, as their skill set improves. So other forms of property typically depreciate over time, but insured slaves actually accrue value over time, which is part of what made them a bargain. The other thing about insured slaves, the reason why so many slaves in these categories was insured is that sometimes they were rented out to corporations because after the slave trade was outlawed, there were limited ways to bring slaves into the country, either through sort of kidnapping, smuggling. But if you wanted enslaved people in abundance as workers, you would often go to someone who already had them in abundance and rent them from that person. And when that person rented those slaves out, they would often insure them to make sure they could recover most of the value of that asset if it died while in someone else's possession. So as slaves were being rented out, they were often being insured, and usually based on sort of a few categories in which skills were highly valued. And the tie to reparations is that we have access to some data on insured slaves because of the reparations movement, which insisted, as the guy was mentioning yesterday, that financial institutions operating in certain states had to disclose their historic relationship to the slave trade. So what would happen is typically the general counsel of a financial firm would send a letter to the state Department of Insurance and say, essentially like, so that you see here the law passed in 2000 required insurance commissioner to request and obtain information from insurance companies licensed to do business in California, Illinois as well, Maryland. So there's select states in which legislation like this was passed after pressure from reparations movement. And so these state insurance commissioners would document what these companies had been involved with in terms of slavery. Typically, what would happen is one of the sort of major insurance companies had acquired companies over the years that once had antebellum insurance policies. So it wasn't always the case that the company that now held the policies was the company that had initially done the policies. And I'll come to some examples of that. So you see Illinois. I'll try to go through this quickly so that there's plenty of time for the other panelists as well as for Q&A. Okay. And so in the state departments of insurance, the data would look something like this, just kind of a very basic spreadsheet. You see the name of the enslaved person, where that person worked, the kind of work the person did occasionally, the slaveholder, often the location was the same, and then the company that had submitted the records that was the basis for these entries. And I guess one thing I want to point out at the outset, and this is related to the question of legal subjectivity, is that there had actually been a Holocaust-era insurance project in the decade preceding the slave-era insurance legislation, and it was handled entirely differently. So if you can see, for Holocaust-era insurance, the records note that during World War II, many Jewish families in Europe purchased life insurance policies that were ultimately later seized by Nazis or by the German government. And the Holocaust-era insurance project was all about helping families to identify whether or not one of their relatives had lost an insurance policy this way, and then making sure the families got compensation. And they were so invested in compensation through this legislation that even if the insurance company had already paid, like a German, for the value of the policy, they had to pay the family again for the value of that policy. So what's interesting is that the legislation for slave-era insurance specifies that it's merely for sort of pedagogic or educational purposes, that there will be no effort to sort of identify the descendants of the formerly enslaved and to make sure they get compensation in any kind of way. So that, I think, is just important to point out. Okay, so Treasury of Weary Souls. So I began with the data in state insurance agencies, and then that was about 600 and something records. And from that, I built a sort of multimedia archive that's available at treasuryofwearysouls.com. And ultimately, over the years, looking at different archives, personal collections, I came up with like 1,300 policies of enslaved persons who were insured. And the site was actually built by a tech firm called Resilient Coders that's based in Boston that trains young people who are formerly incarcerated, often in juvenile, and it prepares them for jobs in the tech sector. So that's the tech firm that built the site. And on the site, there's different ways to look at the data. So one way of looking at it is by the industry the enslaved people worked in. So all these dots represent like mouse overs, and if you go over one of the entries, it will give you the name of a person who was enslaved: Harry in Alabama, the owner H.M. Wheat, the occupation blacksmith, and it was the Baltimore Life Insurance Company that took out the policy. And the Baltimore Life Insurance Company was actually, in the antebellum period, the insurance firm that had the highest number of policies on insured slaves. And then you can look at the site also by the insurer. So if you notice here, AIG, Aetna, Baltimore Life Insurance, and New York Life Insurance are, excuse me, the insurance companies that either once held, in the case of Baltimore Life Insurance Company, which is now defunct, or still hold, in the case of Aetna, AIG, and New York Life Insurance, the value of these policies. So this was an enslaved person named James in Louisville, Kentucky. The owner was Monroe Courier, occupation barber, New York Life Insurance. So I did an article in Foreign Policy with a cartographer named Bill Rankin that was called The Slave Insurance Market. It was just a very brief sort of infographic discussing it. And after that, New York Life Insurance had them print something saying that technically when they took out these policies on uninsured slaves, they weren't New York Life Insurance, they were called Nautilus at the time. And then, so they didn't want to be associated with that because it wasn't the same company. But then my question becomes, did they give the money back? Because if they didn't give the money back, you know, like you can't want to be associated with the money and not want to be associated with the name of the company. But okay, so legal subjectivity. Part of the reason why I think of this question of legal subjectivity as important, and it's related to some of the work that Anna was just sharing, and that sort of Sir Hilary Beckles has been doing for the lawsuit for Caribbean nations. I think there's this question about legal subjectivity that's at the heart of whether or not people think there's a viable case for reparations, because it's as if you have to have a certain kind of legal subjectivity to be seen as someone worthy of reparations, or to have the case be seen as worthy of redress. Like, in other words, like part of the way that people often think of slavery is as if, well, if slaves weren't legal subjects to begin with, how could they really have been denied rights or victimized in the case of a crime, right? So what we'll notice is that there's a lot of work going into sort of crafting a legal rationale that establishes a basis for the reparations claim in the way of legal subjectivity. And this goes to a point that Balraj was raising in the previous panel about, like, what do we think of modernity or modern civilization? Why does the term modern come up so often when we discuss slavery or when we discuss the rights of oppressed people or African people? And if you see in this passage by Sir Hilary Beckles, he says, crimes against humanity have been an essential feature of the rise of European imperial modernity. So again, we have both the idea of crime against humanity, and modernity. And so, you know, on the one hand, modernity or modern can seem like a sort of lazy or vague and even problematic category, right? What does modern mean? Modern presumes pre-modern. It presumes a moment when something was primitive or something like that. I was reading an early draft of a book by a colleague, Sven Beckert, The Empire of Cotton, and in the early draft, every time he said modern capitalism, I would just cross out modern, yeah? And then when he read it, he said, well, why, you know, I'm interested in modern capitalism, and I'm saying, well, modern capitalism as opposed to what? Is there a form of capitalism that's not modern? What's your investment in modern? Doesn't modern suggest a pre-modern? But he was invested in it, so he preferred to use it. And, you know, to his credit, Sven used modern in a way that's consistent with, say, C.L.R. James, Michel Rolfe Trio, other people. So while some scholars would think of modern as 19th century, 18th century economic formations, they would argue that the birth of modernity is the birth of the Atlantic world, that the slave plantation was the first modern industry, that enslaved people were the first modern workers. And so what I take from this argument is that the idea of modernity is about a claim to a world that's interconnected, right? That prior to the modern moment, prior to the 15th century, you have disparate economic activity all throughout the world. But from the formation of the modern world, there's been this exchange, there's been this sort of forms of diplomacy that tie people together. And that's why slavery is considered a crime against humanity and a sort of modern crime, because in a sphere in which we already agree that all people are deserving of certain kinds of rights, some of those rights have been violated, right? Prior to the formation of modern diplomacy or modern trade, the history of the world looks like the history of warfare, where there's no guarantees about anything. Like, if it's merely about warfare and plunder and conquest, you really don't have a claim to anything. It's only in a kind of presumed diplomatic sphere in which people are entitled to certain kinds of treatment and rights, you can make a claim that your rights have been violated. So from what I gather, the framework of the modern, of modernity, is being used to insist upon a kind of either implicit or explicit diplomatic sphere in which people have certain kinds of rights. I'll skip through. Okay, so again, from Hilary Beckles, the central question of Caribbean reparations movement is, does this project meet certain kinds of criteria? The injustice is well documented, victims must be identifiable, and current members of the group must continue to suffer harm. So, you know, his work and work Anna was referring to in her work, there is kind of exhaustive scholarly research being undertaken that establishes the legal basis for these claims. And that's dealing with the Caribbean lawsuits. In the case of African Americans, I think about this question in terms of, part of the reason why I called it a treasury of weary souls, the weary part was weariness suggests exhaustion, labor, exploitation. You could be weary from a trying life. There's also kind of biblical connotation, the weariness. But I also called it a treasury because I wanted it to be clear that it's an archive of value, right? It's about people whose labor made them valuable, whose skills were highly valued in the marketplace. And I did want it to be available for a certain kind of reparations project if someone can go in and identify that that is their ancestors. And so, interestingly, a woman named Audrey Moselle Ross, who's an amateur historian, who lives in Virginia, it just so happens that she lives in an area where some formerly enslaved and insured coal miners built a church, and some of the last names of the church founders are the same as some of the last names of the enslaved people in the database. And she can demonstrate, I think she will be able to demonstrate, that those are her ancestors or people from her community in that database. The church that they founded is now called First Baptist Church of Midlothian in Virginia. So that's like one of the few instances in which someone might be able to identify an ancestor. But as you might have noted, a lot of the entries just have a first name, right? So a formerly enslaved person who just has a first name, how exactly do you prove that that is your ancestor? And then also there's a further complication that the legislation specified that this would not be about redress for victims, but just about sort of educational, pedagogical purposes. Although I think that's less significant, and I think if someone could establish that that was her, his, or their ancestors, that they would still have a case. So the research that I've done on convict leasing and convict labor actually emerged from this project because while I was building the spreadsheet to give to resilient coders to build the site, I noticed that a lot of the entries from Kentucky did not identify a form of employment. Like, it wasn't clear what the enslaved people were doing. So I started doing archival research in Kentucky to figure out what enslaved people in Kentucky were doing. And it turned out they were usually working in hemp. And hemp was, it was highly valued because in Kentucky, the agriculture was not suited to cotton and cotton plantations. So although slavery was legal in Kentucky, they didn't have cotton, so they used hemp to make clothes, to make baskets. They made sails. They sold to the U.S. Navy. They made rope and all kinds of things with cotton, with hemp instead of cotton. And then, Kentucky is interesting because slavery was legal, but it was not part of the Confederacy. So Kentucky had this kind of liminal relationship to slavery in some ways. But I started learning about slavery in Kentucky and hemp, and then I found this this letter that the warden of the prison in Kentucky had written to the governor of the state saying that he didn't want to produce hemp anymore, even though it had been the biggest source of revenue in the penitentiary for 3 decades. And that was surprising to me because from everything else I'd read, hemp was really only farmed outside on small family plots, And then, so as I started researching the Kentucky penitentiary more, I learned that in 1825, this wealthy textile manufacturer, Joel Scott, had convinced the state legislature to lease the prison to him, to have him run as his personal business, and then he would cut them in on a fixed amount and a percentage of the profits. And so this seems to me is 1825. It's like 4 decades before people typically think convict leasing began. And part of what was interesting about it is that, we associate convict leasing with inmates farmed out to private corporations. But what Joel Scott did was transform the penitentiary into his own corporation and then build a bunch of industries within the penitentiary, including most notably hemp. And so, this is interesting to think of this for a number of reasons. One, because it sort of revises our understanding of the history of convict leasing, starting much earlier. Two, the penitentiary in Kentucky had white and black inmates, and men and women. So that also changes how we think of the origin of convict leasing, because not only is it typically associated with the 13th Amendment, but the notion is somehow that it was created merely to preserve something analogous to slavery. And one implication of that claim is that convict leasing is so dastardly that it would only have been created to preserve slavery and would only have been done to African Americans. But interestingly, we see it starting much earlier in a prison that was integrated and also had people of different gender persuasions. Um, and this also has different kind of ramifications I want to sort of discuss, in the sense that, to the extent that Kentucky is part of sort of the Appalachian region in the Rust Belt, it sort of lends something to this claim that many sort of rural, poorly educated white people have, that they have been historically exploited and underserved and underappreciated and neglected. And while they often sort of have misplaced aggression, right, against underrepresented groups and immigrants, it is interesting to notice that when you look at like crime or incarceration statistics, it's often the case that like Appalachian whites are the only group of white people or non-black or non-Latino people that have sort of comparable arrest rates, right, or something like that. So there's something about thinking of some people in the Appalachian Rust Belt regions as the descendants of these people who were part of this early convict leasing experiment that helps us better understand their historical location with respect to incarceration in the broader U.S. economy. This is an example of the kind of work people have done on, this kind of person would have been working on hemp, like a kind of, this is in the early 20th century, an African-American man farming hemp in a way that was analogous to probably how it was done on slave plantations. Okay, so the research I was alluding to just was done by the Nobel Prize winning economist Angus Deaton on sort of mortality rates. And while in many ways the research is probably overstated, it just kind of demonstrates that there's kind of, or suggests there's escalating or really high mortality rates amongst whites with respect to some other groups. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about sort of builds on that, which is the case of reparations, or the fiscal basis of reparations, if we think about reparations for all people potentially. I think one way to think about the 2008 bailout is that it was coercive, right? Prior to the bailout, it was noted by many scholars and journalists that Americans were reluctant to bail out Wall Street and sort of felt like the people responsible for the economy, for sort of damaging the economy, shouldn't take taxpayer money to resolve this dilemma they've created, and that, it was sort of this way in which capitalism was celebrated until it broke down, and then people were kind of claiming a kind of socialist project. And so if we take seriously this idea that the bailout was coercive, and if in fact you could argue that through a number of different kind of clandestine operations that the bailout was itself a kind of crime, it would suggest that there is a constituency deserving of redress, right? Now, for any class action lawsuit, you have to clarify the constituency. So it would be like, well, who is it that was exactly damaged by the 2008 bailout? And that would seem to be all American citizens or all taxpayers at least, right? So typically, it's been claimed that about 122 million people pay taxes in a given year. And if you divide the amount that the bailout allegedly cost, sort of presumably cost the American economy, it's arguably somewhere in the neighborhood of $8.5 trillion. And it's interesting that in particular, $150 billion at least went to AIG, and AIG is obviously connected to the history of slavery and insurance also, as I showed in the earlier slides. But $8.5 trillion divided by 122 million taxpayers is $70,000 for all taxpayers. And that's interesting because what it would mean then is that if all taxpayers got $70,000, that's something like a stimulus, which is what people were calling for in the first place, like rather than a bailout, a stimulus for taxpayers. Another way to calculate the value of the bailout is to say that the collateral for the bailout given by the U.S. government to the financial services industry is the value of the U.S. economy, like the GDP in that year. So the GDP in 2008, and this, my thinking on this is informed by Bob Meister, who's written about sort of some different ways to theorize justice in monetary terms. But the collateral of the U.S. economy in 2008, the GDP would be $14 trillion. So $14.7 trillion divided by I have a higher number of taxpayers here, but it would be at least maybe 80,000 to $100,000. So again, that's like a sizable amount for each individual taxpayer to receive by way of stimulus. So just to kind of recap and close, I think it's interesting to take seriously a research project concerned with establishing an actuarial basis for reparations for the descendants of enslaved people, whose some of whose ancestors we are sort of discovering through this research on insurance and slavery. It's worth considering coercive forms of punishment that even white people have been subjected to if you think about the history of convict leasing. And it's perhaps even more interesting, at least for our purposes, what it might mean to kind of make a claim for reparations based on the bailout or on other kinds of crimes, white-collar crimes, or coercive measures that the U.S. government has taken. And I think that one way of thinking about this kind of project is that to the extent that actuarial methods are used in a very mundane way to achieve all kinds of forms of redress, we might also just think of them in a very kind of mundane way to try to adjudicate different kinds of injustices. All right, thank you.